Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where we'll be chatting about Grinding Gear Games' goal for Standard League. If you are new to the channel, then you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. Today's discussion is going to focus on Standard League and we're going to ask one very simple question. What is Standard's purpose? When we think about Standard League, what exactly is the design goal? What exactly is the philosophy? What exactly is the purpose of Standard? Because it seems to be that there might be a little bit of a disruption between what the purpose of Standard is, or the presented purpose of Standard, and what it actually gets used for. Some of you are already going to be memeing, oh, Iron, who would actually talk about Standard? Well, believe it or not, there's actually several people right here, even in our community, that play in Standard. Yes, there are players who play in Standard. So the memes aside, we're going to chat about Standard today, and it's okay to chat about Standard. Now, a lot of people complain whenever we chat about Standard, oh, you're just going to talk about the Standard economy and nobody cares about that. Well, we're not going to be chatting about the Standard economy. We're not going to be chatting about complaints about stash tabs or about organization or about implementation of core mechanics into Path of Exile's Standard League. We're not chatting about any of the usual stuff that people meme about when players and various communities chat about Standard. Today, we want to get into the nitty-gritty of what's Standard's purpose. Thanks so much, by the way, to everybody for their comments and for their votes on our most recent poll about whether or not you've played Standard for at least 1 hour. I was very surprised by the results of this. I thought for sure like maybe 1 or 2 people would say yes. So I was very encouraged to see that, hi, there's more than just me out there playing Standard and enjoying Path of Exile, maybe with some longer term goals. But we'll chat more about longer term goals in just a minute. So what exactly is Standard League? Well, up in the top left view of your view screen, you can see that there's this very helpful graphic that's available on the POE wiki that breaks down exactly what Standard League is. Standard is where everything else goes. It's the end of all roads. Someone once famously said, all roads lead to Rome. Well, in Path of Exile language, all roads lead to Standard. If you have a hardcore character and they die, they go back to Standard. If they're playing in a hardcore challenge league and your character dies, it goes back to Standard. If you're playing in a 3-month challenge league, but it's a softcore challenge league, it doesn't matter. At the end of that league, your character is going to migrate to Standard. Standard is the basket. It is the catch-all. It is the ultimate way of being a fishing net, as it were, for all characters, for all items, for all currency. It's where everything goes in POE whenever a challenge league is over or whenever a character dies in any version of a hardcore league, be that a temp league or a permanent league. Standard is the catch-all of where everything ends up at. So since Standard is the catch-all for everything, then you might be able to say, well, if Standard is where everything ultimately ends up at, then maybe if you've got longer term goals, or maybe if you don't have as much playtime, or you don't want to deal with learning a new challenge league mechanic every couple of months, maybe Standard is where you should play. Maybe Standard is where you should develop long-term goals, or where you should learn the game, because the game won't change as much in Standard since that's where everything catches back into, right? Well, we'll see about that. The problem with trying to set yourself up for having long-term goals when playing in Standard League is the problem of disruption, at least as we're going to discuss it today. There's lots of other problems and lots of other complaints that players have made throughout the ages about Standard League. But today we're talking specifically about the philosophy and the existence of Standard League. And the reality is anybody that wants to play Standard League for having longer term goals, whether that's for their build or for experiencing content, the reality is those players experience disruption. Characters in Standard, every single new league, have the potential to face massive changes. Those could be buffs. Those could also be massive nerfs. Core itemization, or maybe even core ascendancy, or maybe even a huge part of the passive tree could be reworked every single league, and that impacts not only players who are experiencing the disruption of a fresh new challenge league, it also disrupts the players who are playing in Standard League who had what they thought was a safe spot, a longer term place to play and to build their character out. The reality of item rebalancing and item reworks means that while you may have seen a build be played, and not even years ago, we're talking just the last league or maybe even the current league, and you want to start working on a particular build that you have seen in action. And so you go to begin working on that build in Standard League. You've got all your currency, all your gear, all your characters, and so you start from there. Even then, in a few months' time, when the next patch comes through, there's no guarantee that the uniques, that the rares, that the crafting methods, any of that stuff will still exist in its present form, because Standard changes every single major patch, because the major patches not only impact a rollout of a new Challenge League, it also impacts everything that currently exists inside Standard League. Now, please don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not here today to whine and moan that new stuff comes to Standard. I think that's great. New Challenge Leagues, new items, even new balance patches coming to Standard League, I think are a good thing. When new stuff gets added to Standard, that's fine. That's consistent with the philosophy that Standard is the basket, the catch-all, the fishnet that grabs all the characters, all the stuff, all the items. That part makes sense. Standard is where everything goes. But when Standard changes at the same rate as Challenge Leagues, then there's really no consistency and no opportunity for players to set longer term goals and really have any sort of guarantee that the build that they're working on today is still going to be viable or functionable in the same way that it is today in 3 months down the road when the next new Challenge League comes out. I've got no problem with new stuff being added to Standard. And really, disruption doesn't even happen when new stuff comes to Standard. Disruption happens when existing stuff changes inside Standard. That's what disrupts gameplay and really disrupts the philosophy of Standard being that catch-all. New stuff, just on its own, provides opportunity for players to build and further expand their particular goals or their particular character. But disruption happens not when the new stuff comes in, but when the present stuff in Standard gets changed. I choose the word disruption because it means this. This is the first simple definition that comes up for disruption when you type it into Google. It is a disturbance or problems which interrupt an event, activity, or process. That's what it feels like when you're playing Standard and you're building out a character. Let's say you're using cluster jewels to build a character, and cluster jewels get nerfed in some way or changed or buffed, but maybe the crafting mechanism for actually acquiring those jewels actually changes. Maybe there's a whole new tier of crafting that becomes available. See, that's new, that's fine, that just provides opportunity. But if there's a change to the existing cluster jewels that you were planning on building around, well, that causes a disturbance or an interruption of the process of you building out your character. As Obi-Wan Kenobi would once said, I felt a great disturbance in the Standard League. Like every single time a new Challenge League comes out, Standard League players have to face this reality that there is a disruption, there is an interruption, and it's not just that new stuff is coming into Standard League, it's that the present stuff in Standard League is being interrupted because of the new balance changes that come into the game with every single new major patch. Now, at this point, you might be saying, well, who really cares, Iron? I mean, are there really that many players out there who play Standard? Yes, there actually are. Do I have any data on this? No, it's all anecdotal. You can drop me a comment down below and absolutely smack me around for simply saying that it's anecdotal. I'll simply say this. Grinding Gear Games thinks Standard is important enough to keep it around, all right? So it's an officially sanctioned and supported version of Path of Exile that is supported by the game developers. So it's something that they see enough players playing it to keep it around and to keep it going. So for players who expressly say or have to recognize the reality, hey, I can't really build or plan on accomplishing all the goals that I'd like to accomplish in a Challenge League, maybe Standard is where I'm going to be at. They experience disruption whenever a new Challenge League comes in simply because of the balance changes and the various nerfs and the various redesigns and reworks of crafting and items in the passive tree. All right, a couple of you have been asking for me to go to the paint, so I'm going to go to the paint pretty heavily here. I'm breaking out the brush and doing my best Bob Ross impersonation. So suggestions moving forward. I don't like it whenever community members in any gaming community simply lay out the problems and don't make any suggestions. This doesn't mean that I've got good suggestions. I'm simply trying to say that I'm at least willing to think about this and try to make some suggestions. So one suggestion is to let standard remain as unchanged as possible. You could do this with maybe a once a year big time patch that comes through and impacts standard, something that allows players who are playing standard a bit more consistency and a bit more time than every 3 months, potentially looming over their build, or potentially looming over their crafting item, or potentially looming over their methodology of playing Path of Exile, potentially changing every 3 months. Players who intentionally play standard generally play it, again, anecdotal, totally anecdotal, I have no stats to back this up, but the players who I've chatted with who play standard play it because they've got longer term goals, and every 4 months or 3 months, as it were, when new leagues come out and new balance patches come out, those players are disrupted from their goals and their gameplays while they're playing in standard. The second suggestion is that any changes that come to standard come as additions, not as subtractions. Now, a lot of you would say, oh, well, that leaves a lot of legacy items. That means that nothing would get nerfed. That means that a whole bunch of stuff would get changed. I'm not going to comment on the economy here. Zero comments on the economy about, well, this legacy item is more powerful than this other thing, and how would players do this? It's standard. You don't have to play it if you don't want to. Players who want to push for big-time, long-term goals can do that. And there can be some really cool, awesome legacy items in standard, and there already are big-time, old school legacy items in standard that haven't gotten changed. So asking for this change number 2 or suggestion number 2, that any changes that come to standard come as additions, not as subtractions, really isn't asking for GGG to deviate all that much from what they've already allowed inside Standard League, which is simply adding things on and then letting legacy things be really cool legacy things. We've already mentioned the third suggestion basically in conjunction with the first suggestion, like let standard remain as unchanged as possible. And if you got to change it, basically maybe change it on an annual timeline rather than on a quarterly timeline. As the paint bucket above my balding head shows, really the goal ought to be that changes don't disrupt standard play. Disruption in league play is a good thing. Like, we all look forward to it every couple of months where there's an economy reset. We've got to run through the 10-act story campaign, which players complain about all the time, and yet players are always willing to do it every couple of months. So that disruption is even welcomed by players, and we see that with massive numbers of players coming back to experience new league content because of the disruption. The disruption actually draws players back in, but standard, it's a different ball game. The disruption doesn't necessarily draw players to standard. It's actually a turnoff. It's actually something that interrupts their progress towards something else they're working on. So with the suggestions that we've made, basically the paint image changes to this above my slightly balding forehead. Rather than seeing disruption in the new league and disruption in standard, we see just disruption with the new league. And then when new stuff comes to standard, it's an opportunity for your character to expand rather than a disruption to what your character and to what your progress and to what your goals already were as you experience Standard League. Continuing with this paint analogy here, this is the presentation of what Standard is, at least so far from what we can tell from Grinding Gear Games' philosophy of Standard. They basically present Standard as, hey, it's this catch-all, it's this league that everything goes to. It's where all of your items, all of your characters, all your stuff goes. So every year, the first quarter, we get a new league. The second quarter, we get a new league, etc., third and fourth quarter. And it all goes to Standard, right? So Standard is this catch-all for all of these different leagues and all of these different characters. But while that's the idea and while that's the presentation, the reality is something different for players who play Standard. Rather than having one bucket that catches all of these 4 different leagues that we have every single year, and I'm very thankful for those leagues, instead what we get is basically 4 different versions of Standard throughout the course of the year. While we have a yearly expansion that generally is an endgame expansion, at least that's what we've experienced for the last couple of years, that changes the way how we interact with bosses, new content with the Atlas of Worlds, that sort of stuff. That's great, but instead of saying Standard is the same for that year and for that expansion, and it'll simply get this new stuff that rolls out, instead what we basically have is these 4 patches, these 4 major patches that change the goals and the play and interrupt the progress of characters in Standard. So really, we don't have one Standard League. I mean, you still keep all of your stuff. Stuff doesn't migrate, but we kind of have this hybrid where we've got kind of like 4 mini Standard Leagues, where you've got a character that you may have worked on in quarter 1 in Standard League, and by the time quarter 3 comes around, that build has been totally gutted. The core mechanics of it have absolutely changed. The meta has been force shifted by nerfs and rebalancing from grinding gear games, and now your character that you were working on in Standard in quarter 1 is a complete wash of a character by the time quarter 3 comes around. Enough of my paint memes. Thanks so much for joining us today for today's discussion. What do you think? Do you think my presentation here is accurate in any way? Do you think Standard should remain more consistent than it presently does? Or do you think that I'm way off base here and maybe Standard is more consistent than the picture I'm painting, as it were? Do you think builds in Standard truly are allowed to experience long-term goals and long-term planning? And do you think that maybe there's just a few particular outliers that maybe 1 or 2 popular builds get hit along the way, as it were, throughout the year? And maybe I'm making too much out of all of this. I look forward to reading all of your comments down below and interacting with each and every one of you as time allows. Thanks once again for watching, and I hope the upcoming 3.15 League is the league a Mirror of Calandra drops for you. Or if you play Standard, hey, I hope you drop one there today too.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.